In this topic, the expert is Michael Kirchner, who is here with us. I'm the lecturer, but he's the expert. And I hope if you have any questions, we could answer them together later. Buber is one of the most important and influential writers, thinkers, and politicians in the German Jewish culture. At first sight, Martin Buber and Janusz Korczak have no commonalities except that they are both classics of pedagogy and both Jews. Both were born in 1878, Korczak perhaps 1879, and originate from Polish Judaism, but they have a different social-cultural background and a different assimilation status. But overall, it emerged very evidently that one is a professor for social and religious philosophy as a theorist, and the other is a children's doctor and head of an orphanage as a practitioner. But let's have a closer look at that. Both connect through a wide-ranging theoretical and practical function in pedagogy. I name individual children's education, education to a community, school reforms, and adult education. In addition to that, are Buber and Korczak very productive authors. Buber's edition takes 21 volumes, and Korczak works 15 volumes. Both editions in Germany are published in the same publishing company. Both are to be understood as European intellectuals. Both represent ideas of the utopian socialism. Buber in his work Paths into Utopia, and Korczak in his School of Life. And they both aim at anarchistic community drafts. Buber and Korczak both think and act in the spirit of a Jewish humanism. Both have disputed about Zionism and its diverse occurrences. Both have, last but not least, influenced the kibbutz pedagogy theoretically and practically. We like to think that these preliminary observations are already enough commonalities in order to take a comparing look at the thoughts and actions of Martin Buber and Janusz Korczak's education. It is without a doubt right and necessary to put Buber's and Korczak's pedagogy and social pedagogy in the context of contemporary reform pedagogy. Remember Buber's talk about the educational in Heidelberg, 1925, and Korczak and his completely reformative School of Life, 1907. As a magic formula for the intended reforms served the following demand from everything from the child's perspective. The educational reforms aimed at the reduction of heteronomy and authority and trust in self-activity, independence, and self-administration of the child. The educational reforms wanted to eliminate the book school with their vast standardized education code, and instead they wanted to approach school with real life again. The societal reforms intended the reduction of classifying hierarchies in state and society and strived for collaborative and/or cooperative organization of the Commonwealth, mostly in the circumference of socialist and anarchic concept. We hope not to be disappointing with the following execution because we want to go into further detail about an examination about the dialogic educational thinking, since that is the way most examinators like to go, especially with Buber's talk about education and I and thou. Instead, we will orientate ourselves on the late Buber, and for that, especially his work, Past in Utopia, about community and their realization from 1915. We divide our executions in social utopias of Buber and Korczak, education in a we sense as striving for the we, striving towards community through education. At the beginning of the 20th century, many movements of the education reforms and the societal reforms started to connect through different ways. In the years before and after the World War I, Buber and Korczak both occupied themselves very intensively with imaginations of libertine socialism and an anarchism, that way it is represented by Charles Fourier, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin, Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, and Gustav Landauer. Terms such as community, new community, and utopia are of central meaning for Buber. It is verified that both Buber and Korczak are influenced by Fourier's, Tolstoy's, and Kropotkin's thinking. In the context, Korczak's co-worker Stanislav Rogalski comment is very interesting. You could recognize the origin of Korczak's educational thought in Fourier's utopian socialist educational thesis, from which Korczak borrowed his thoughts of a free, harmonic development of all inner strengths and skills of the child, based on hobbies, activities, and independence. Borrowed also in the context of believing that the future of the human character are good. In this context, Korczak's opinionated linkage of societal reforms with educational reforms are of special interest. Since his time in school, Korczak advocated for the connection of a social policy with a social pedagogy. Here we like to remind you that not only was he committed as a tutor in the slums of Warsaw and as a librarian, as a part of lending library for all, but also his participation in many aid organizations, like, for example, Warsaw Charity Society, Society for Summer Colonies, Society for Child Friends, Help for Orphans, Jewish Agency for Palestine. Oftentimes, only Korczak guideline from 1894-95, reforming the world means reforming the education, is being quoted. But he also represented the following mission very determinedly. Reforming the education means reforming the world. About the correlation of school reform and state reform, he writes, school reforms stand in a close correlation to general reforms of the political system. The obligatory education will be decided depending on how many material funds the state has for the goals of the school system. This enables him to achieve the desired goal faster and more consistently and guarantees himself extensive influence on the educational institutions and conscientious fulfillment of duty by well-paid officials or beckons with special rights and privileges, and thus lures a moral parents and wins the cooperation in his sense. To the situation of the contemporary pedagogy, Korczak noticed the education question began to force itself on the pedagogical and societal thinking of our time. To this day, this question evokes the interest of pedagogues and society activists around the whole world. Attempts to be active in this field, theoretically or practically, are being made everywhere. Dom Sierot and Nasz Dom contribute to this work. They strive on an elaboration of a method for group education. We want to establish the children's society based on the principles of justice, fraternity, the same rights and duties. Education in a we sense and striving for the we. Beyond this social utopian foundation of the pedagogical thinking and acting, there are overlapping education drafts of Buber and Korczak. Not only that, but also another less thought out common dimension, the orientation that is in principle of the pedagogical impact on a we and less on a new society. The Jewish social pedagogue and Buber expert Abraham Shapira recorded the human sphere of dialogics in Buber's I and thou is being almost exclusively aimed at a single counterpart, at a you, not at a we. Without being able to show Buber's ways of thinking in detail, one could still say that for him, the we is a category between the interpersonal and the social. Buber writes, the human made his experiences as an I. He made experiences with others and with himself, but as a we. Again and again, he built and built up experiences of the world as a we. So Buber extended, as we just heard, the dialogical relation I-you to an intrinsic we, especially under theoretical aspects. On the contrary, Korczak becomes especially in practice aware of the indispensable involvement of the we. Korczak was premature high school student and medical student, so he obviously had through studies about the classics of pedagogy such as Rousseau, Pestalozzi, Froebel, and Tolstoy. But in the summer colonies in 1947, Korczak had to make experiences. First, how difficult it was to handle the connection between pedagogical theory and pedagogical practice. And secondly, the varying procedure between the individual care to a child and the pedagogical work in and with a group. Korczak reflects, on the next day, we made a nice walk through the woods. For the first time, I didn't speak to the children, but with the children. I didn't talk about what I wanted them to be, but about what they wanted and could be. Maybe I convinced myself for the first time that you could learn a lot from children, that they also set demands on conditions, that they make objections, and that they have the right to do so. Buber's statement to this topic is, the conversation with a child is a true interdependency exchange of experiences. We read from Korczak, here thrives a beautiful work, a wonderful lesson. The caregivers teach the children teach the educators. Significant for Korczak is the experience that the children need to be not only integrated, but that they also need to contribute equally to the pedagogical impacts. For Korczak, the child is in many ways an expert. That is why Korczak supported his pedagogical work with the autarky and independence of the children. Goal for Korczak is the transformation of 100 children to 100 employees, of which everyone, depending on age, strength, condition, and the degree of ability and will, has the duty of working together in the collective nest. Already after a few years, Korczak can determine host, employee, and head of the house got to be the child. Everything that is being described in the following is the work of the children, not ours. As a way of independence of the child, Korczak chooses the awakening of self-strength of the child within social relations. He says, let's say societal education is based on self-administration and a developing discipline with regard to voluntarily take duties, as well as the individual education of self-control and the inner natural need for self-improvement. Korczak writes, we want to replace discipline with order, force with voluntary adjustment of the individual on the societal living rooms. We want to turn the soulless moral into a joyful striving for improvement and self-control. We value self-respect just as much as the goodwill for other people, or even better fellow citizens. About the societal and pedagogical meaning from Nasz Dom and Dom Sierot, let's read, education needs to care equally for the well-being of a group as well as the well-being of an individual. It needs to be societal and at the same time individual. Social habits and moral forces need to be trained parallelly. According to Skalska, for Korczak, it generally applies, replacing the force through the voluntary and aware adjustment of the individual to the shape of the collaborative life. No words, no teaching. Such a construction and atmosphere of the boarding school so that the children learn to appreciate their stay there. Not only do they learn to appreciate, they also have a personal interest in doing the biggest possible effort for self-control, conquest, voting, and to adjust oneself to the requirements and needs of the environment. To make a cautious approach, step by step, not aiming at an immediate result, always having the conductive idea in mind, to help the child being independent, to keep establishing new opportunities for it, and to show personal initiative. Through that way, the child will become a subservient spirit that will take over the work of an educator, effortlessly and represent the educator. A child that searches, calls, brings, cleans, pays attention, reminds, knows, and has heard, says, will be a true representative in no time. Driving towards community through education. Martin Buber writes in 1919, the real life between humans and humans, the real time between humans and humans does not take place in the abstracting of the state, but significantly there were a vitality of the special, functional, emotional, and spiritual togetherness exists in the community. Furthermore, he writes about the bullet points, community as a living association. Living is everyday life. Is all the days, day for day, hour for hour, high and low situation, claims for heaven and earth, everything together. I mean nothing less when I say life. Living associations, so when humans want to live their lives together, then communities is being established as a faith and appeal. Buber differentiates such a community as evolved attachment from the collectivity. Collectivity is only a bundling that puts individual next to individual. A community, though, or growing community, is not anymore next to each other, but being closely together. It's an amount of people that strives for a goal together. Everywhere, a collision, a dynamic counterpart, experiencing a flood from it to you, from I to you. Community is where community happens. Referring to pedagogy, this means for Buber, a significant task of education is the education that strives towards community. He writes, the real characterization is the real education towards community. Such an education happens, as we just explained, on the one hand, in the individual development of the child in the I-you encounter, and on the other hand, in the expansion about an intrinsic we towards community. Buber considers the way towards community in the following way. The inner framework of the human cohabitation can't be renewed through a decretated and set institution. The inner structure of a human coexistence cannot be renewed through decreed and resolved institutions, but only through a gradually expanding rejuvenation of the cellular tissue that sprouts from within through the constant formation and linkage of new, genuine, strong community cells, genuine cooperatives, genuine communities, through a new becoming and realizing of the relationships from person to person, from group to group, and thus also from people to people. We think that Buber's mostly theoretical thoughts about education towards community can be executed very well in practice. We would also say the same about Korczak's educational concept. Not only did Korczak experiment in detail concerning the institutions for the self-administration of the children, such as the parliament, the comradeship court, and the children's paper, but he also experimented concerning the total draft for the cohabitation of the children and educators in his orphanages, especially with the model of educational cooperative society. Korczak combines educational ideas of anarchism to the kibbutz education. He also shows a special closeness to Buber. Here they both share the guiding principles freedom and voluntariness, equality, basic supply, self-organization, and self-administration, office rotation, equality of physical and mental work. The working community or educational cooperative of the children and the educators does not only include the reference on the concrete work that has to be done, no matter if it's a boarding school or a kibbutz, but also the contact in the we. Buber writes, the relationship of the members of a big kibbutz to a common object is not enough. It is about whether direct contact from one human to another exists, and if the turn to the other really means him in his being and his suchness. The common thing does not do the trick on its own. If there's not only an orientation about the common thing, but also an interaction between the people among each other, it gives the common thing more meaning. But the common thing alone cannot replace interpersonal relations. For Korczak, exactly this we forms the condition for the new community. For example, in the comradeship code. The code does not only give the fact more meaning, but it also creates utopian and anarchistic, violence and domination-free interrelations in the encounters, especially in the forgiveness. Let's sum up. The utopia of a different we and a new community that Buber reflects in being tested in practice by Korczak. For both Korczak and Buber, the we is the middle phalanx between the dialogue and the community. Here, one needs to emphasize that this we is way more than just a work community. With the example of the target, the forgiving for the comradeship code, this can be clarified for Korczak. Also, the model of the educational cooperative goes way further than just the collaboration. Already in the summer colonies in 1947, then especially in the orphanages, Dom Sierot, 1912 to 42, and Nasz Dom, 1919 to 1936, Korczak experiments with such cooperative models. In Eretz Israel, he always allowed to experience them. He reports about that. Even if he uses the term cooperative not so much, one can still prove that many of the organization forms that he tried out include cooperative elements. One can understand the term cooperative or cooperative society as a merger for equal people that are in the same or similar problematic situations and that look together for solutions. Everyone introduces their possibilities and qualities. The cooperation founds in the self-help, the self-administration, and the self-responsibility. The self-help includes the mediation of every needed goods, up to collaborative exercise, service, cooperation in and through the group, up to community forming rights, duties, and rules that lead to a community ethic. As principles of a cooperative, one can count the voluntary equal work of every single member for the welfare of the community, the mutual equivalent help, and the encouragement of independence and self-strength of every member. In this sense, one can prove very important and formative elements in thinking and acting of Korczak and Dom Sierot and Nasz Dom. These elements can stimulate or inspire cooperative organization forms of today. Since decades, the critical theory of the social demands a paradigm shift for social groups. From the offer to the demand orientation and to the development of a common and collaborative accomplishment of tasks. Through that, Korczak searched for new and different ways to a new solidary community in form of a cooperative. That means from the individual reflected buying power, grounded in the rights of every single child from pronunciation and co-determination, up to a collective participation power. This individual and the same time collaborative self-help implies the four criteria of a collaborative. the promotion principle in which every single person invests in the common thing, the identity principle, independent from individual possibilities and interests, the democracy principle, through which everyone has an equal voting right, and the solidarity principle as a common thing. You can find all the four principles as we try to prove them, theoretically in Buber's work and practically at Korczak's work. Through individual independence, the child is a co-worker and expert, basic democratic institutions like parliament, comradeship court, self-administration council, one can open new and free living spaces in an emancipatory way for the adults and the children, not only in the old, but also in today's socio-political navigation models. Thank you.